Morning mist blanketed the rolling fields of Greenridge Valley, wrapping the land in a tranquil stillness. Caleb Hart worked methodically in his crop rows, each movement a quiet testament to years of discipline. Once a special forces leader, Caleb had traded battlefields for furrows, chaos for calm. But the faint ache in his hands wasn't from the soil. It was a reminder of the life he'd left behind. "Morning, Caleb." Mrs. Evelyn Grant's cheerful voice pierced the quiet. She approached with a basket of muffins, her smile as warm as the rising sun. Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Evelyn, you're spoiling me again." "Someone has to," she teased. "Besides, Lily would never forgive me if I didn't make sure you were fed." The mention of his late wife softened Caleb's sharp features. He took the basket, murmuring his thanks. Their quiet exchange was interrupted by a low rumble that grew louder, a sound Caleb had come to recognize over the past few weeks. Evelyn's smile faltered as she turned toward the dirt road. "They're back," she whispered, her voice trembling. 12 motorcycles roared into view, their riders exuding menace. At their head was Steele, a giant of a man with a cruel smile and a leather jacket adorned with the Iron Wolf's insignia. He killed his engine, surveying Caleb's farm with predatory ease. "Nice setup you've got here, farmer," Steele drawled. "Shame if something happened to it. $5,000 a month buys our protection." Evelyn clutched Caleb's arm, her knuckles white. "Don't you dare do anything foolish," she whispered urgently. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his stance calm but unyielding. "You have no business here. Leave now, or regret staying." Steele's laughter echoed across the fields. "Boys, teach this fool a lesson." The attack was over before it began. Caleb moved with a precision honed by years of training. A lead pipe swung toward his head. He sidestepped and disarmed his attacker in one fluid motion. Another lunged with a chain, only to be flipped onto the hard ground. Within moments, the wolves lay scattered and groaning, Steele himself subdued with a fractured wrist. When Sheriff Riley arrived, the scene left him speechless. A quiet farmer, surrounded by zip-tied gang members, calmly tending his crops. "They threatened Evelyn," Caleb explained simply. But this was no mere act of defense. It was the spark that would ignite a transformation far greater than anyone could imagine. The news of Caleb's stand spread like wildfire across Greenridge Valley. By evening, the phone at Sheriff Riley's office was ringing incessantly with calls from concerned citizens, eager reporters, and panicked local business owners. The Iron Wolves had been a scourge on the region for years, and now a single farmer had done what no one else dared. At the county jail, Steele sat in his cell, nursing his injuries and his wounded pride. His second-in-command, Wade Grizzly Carter, paced outside, phone in hand. "What now, boss?" Grizzly asked. Steele scowled, his voice dripping with venom. "We send a message. Get everyone together. That farm burns tonight." Back at the Hart farm, Caleb worked late into the night, replanting crushed seedlings. The rhythmic motions of his work helped him think. He'd lived his life avoiding attention, but now his peaceful sanctuary had become the focal point of a brewing war. A pickup truck rumbled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the dark. Dr. Anna Morales, the local vet and Caleb's late wife's best friend, stepped out. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" she asked, her concern genuine. "I'm fine," Caleb replied, though the weight of the day hung heavy on him. "It's not over yet." Anna crossed her arms. "Steele won't take this lying down. You need help, Caleb." "I'll handle it," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The next morning, Evelyn's grandson Tommy watched from his bedroom window as his grandmother prepared her roses for the town's garden competition. The news of Caleb's confrontation with the wolves had inspired whispers of both admiration and fear. In the shadows, the wolves were preparing their next move. Steele's orders echoed in their hideout. "Tonight we remind Greenridge who runs this valley." Unbeknownst to them, Caleb was ready. Years of experience had taught him to anticipate the moves of his enemies. As the sun set over Green Ridge, a storm was brewing, one that would test Caleb's resolve and the strength of a community caught in the crossfire. Night fell over Green Ridge Valley, blanketing the farm in darkness. The air was thick with tension, every shadow on the horizon a potential threat. Caleb Hart stood on his porch, surveying the quiet landscape with a calm that belied the storm brewing within. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, checking the locks, inspecting the irrigation systems, and repositioning equipment in seemingly haphazard patterns. It wasn't haphazard, though. It was preparation. At the Iron Wolves' hideout, Steele's plan was in motion. A convoy of roaring motorcycles emerged from the warehouse, a pack of 30 riders eager to exact vengeance. Steele rode at the front, his injured wrist braced but his fury unyielding. "Burn it all," he growled to Grizzly, who nodded solemnly. "That farm goes up in flames tonight." But in the quiet corners of the valley, word had already spread. Sheriff Riley sat in his patrol car, his radio crackling with updates from Deputy Clara Bates. "Reports of movement toward Hart's farm," Clara said, her voice tense. "At least 24 riders, maybe more." "Stay sharp," Riley replied, gripping the steering wheel. "We'll move when Caleb calls." Back at the farm, Evelyn Grant arrived, despite Caleb's repeated protests. She carried her signature basket of muffins and a stubborn determination that no biker could scare away. "They threatened my roses," she said matter-of-factly, setting the basket on Caleb's work table. "I'm staying." "Evelyn," Caleb began, exasperated. "This isn't—" "Hush now," she interrupted, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "If Lily were here, she'd tell you the same. Besides, someone needs to keep you fed." Caleb couldn't argue. Evelyn's presence reminded him of why he fought, not for revenge but for the people who called Green Ridge Valley home. As the rumble of engines grew louder, Evelyn reluctantly retreated to the safety of the town. Caleb, meanwhile, extinguished the farmhouse lights and melted into the shadows of his fields. The Iron Wolves arrived in a thunderous roar, their headlights cutting through the night. Steele dismounted, his face set in a predatory grin. "Spread out," he barked. "Flush him out." The bikers fanned out, trampling crops and kicking over equipment. But the chaos was their first mistake. Caleb had prepared for this. Repositioned irrigation pipes sprayed mud and water, disorienting the riders. Floodlights snapped on, casting strange, shifting shadows that made it impossible to pinpoint Caleb's location. From the darkness he struck. One biker lunged toward the barn, but Caleb emerged from the shadows, disarming him with a fluid motion and leaving him groaning in the dirt. Another swung a chain wildly, only to find himself face first in a water trough. One by one, the bikers fell, undone by their own disarray and Caleb's calculated precision. Steele watched in disbelief as his men were neutralized. "Fight back, you cowards!" he roared, grabbing a crowbar. Caleb stepped into the light, calm and unshaken. "It's over, Steele. Take your men and leave." "Never." Steele swung the crowbar, but Caleb sidestepped, grabbing Steele's wrist and twisting until the crowbar clattered to the ground. Steele howled in pain as Caleb zip-tied his hands behind his back. Moments later, Sheriff Riley and his deputies arrived, lights flashing and sirens wailing. The remaining wolves froze, realizing they were outmaneuvered and outnumbered. "Jesus, Caleb," Riley muttered, surveying the scene. "You took down another 20 of them?" "They didn't give me much choice," Caleb replied, already checking his damaged crops. By dawn, the wolves were in custody, their bikes impounded, and Steele was en route to the county jail. But for Caleb, the battle wasn't over. As he replanted Evelyn's roses in the morning light, he felt the weight of what had transpired. This was no longer just about defending his farm. The wolves' defeat had sent ripples through Green Ridge Valley, ripples that would either unify the community or draw more darkness to their quiet haven. For now, Caleb could only prepare for what was to come. The confrontation at Caleb's farm had already become the stuff of legend, by the time the morning sun rose over Green Ridge Valley. The news traveled faster than the wolves themselves could, spreading through whispered conversations in the local diner, hurried phone calls between neighbors, and a flurry of social media posts. At the county jail, Steele sat in a holding cell, seething. His gang had been humiliated, his authority shattered. Worse still, his enforcers had begun to question his leadership. Wade Grizzly Carter approached the cell hesitantly. "Boss, some of the guys, they're talking about walking away. They're saying Hart's right, that we've lost our way." Steele slammed his fist against the bars. "They're weak. If they leave, they'll regret it. We'll burn that farm down and remind this valley who owns it." Meanwhile, at Caleb's farm, a different kind of gathering was taking place. A line of cars pulled up, filled with neighbors and business owners offering support. Evelyn Grant had taken it upon herself to coordinate the effort, turning Caleb's kitchen into an impromptu headquarters. "Caleb, these boys from the hardware store brought lumber to help fix the barn," Evelyn called out as she bustled around. "And Maria from the bakery is bringing lunch." Caleb, who had spent the early hours repairing irrigation lines, hesitated at the sight of the crowd. "Evelyn, this isn't necessary." "Nonsense," she replied firmly. "The wolves didn't just attack you, they attacked all of us. It's time this town stood together." As Caleb worked alongside his neighbors, he noticed something surprising. People who had once kept their distance from one another were now talking, sharing ideas, and offering help. Farmers traded tools, shopkeepers offered supplies, and even the high school's football team showed up to clear debris from the fields. Across town, at the community center, Pastor John Whitaker convened an emergency meeting. He stood before a packed room of business owners, farmers, and townsfolk. "We've all heard what happened at Caleb Hart's farm," he began. "For years, the wolves have ruled through fear. Caleb's shown us that fear can be defeated, but he can't do it alone. It's time we take back our valley." Mike Lawson, owner of the local feed store, raised his hand. "They broke my cousin's leg last year. I've been too afraid to fight back, but after seeing what Caleb did, I'm ready to stand with him." Others echoed Mike's sentiment, one by one committing to defend the valley. Pastor Whitaker called for a plan, and soon the room buzzed with strategies, organizing patrols, setting up communication lines, and helping victims rebuild. But not everyone in the valley was on board. Sheriff Riley faced mounting pressure from state officials who saw Caleb's actions as a liability. "You're telling me one man took down an entire gang? Twice?" a skeptical district attorney questioned during a phone call. "I'm telling you he's keeping this town safe when no one else will," Riley shot back. Later that evening, Deputy Clara Bates joined Riley at the station. "You think this town's ready for what's coming next?" she asked. "They'll have to be," Riley said grimly. "Steele's not done, and we both know more trouble's heading our way." As night fell, Caleb stood on his porch, watching the stars flicker above the valley. Evelyn joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "This isn't just about the farm anymore," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "I know, it's about the valley." He gazed out at the silhouettes of newly repaired fences and freshly planted rows. His farm was no longer just a place of peace, it was the heart of a growing movement. And while Caleb had spent years trying to leave his past behind, he realized now that the skills he once used to protect his country were exactly what this town needed. "Whatever comes next," Caleb said, his voice steady, "we'll face it together." Green Ridge Valley exhaled a collective breath of resilience. For the first time in years, fear wasn't the loudest voice in the community. The wolves were scattered, and Steele's threats were tempered by his jail cell. But even as the town rallied, Caleb Hart remained watchful. Trouble wasn't gone, it was just regrouping. In the pre-dawn hours, Caleb walked the perimeter of his farm, the distant hum of engines carried on the wind. A flicker of unease touched his thoughts. Gangs like the wolves never operated in isolation. There was always a larger pack waiting to strike. At the town diner, Sheriff Riley sat with Deputy Clara Bates over a plate of cold eggs and untouched coffee. "Got word from the state," Riley muttered, pushing the plate aside. "Steele's allies might be coming. They've been seen just over the county line." Clara frowned. "Who are we dealing with?" "A crew called the Crimson Vultures. They're worse than the wolves. Bigger, meaner, and with enough connections to make things messy." Riley sighed. "If they come, the valley won't just face intimidation, it'll face destruction." By mid-morning, the first signs of the vultures appeared. Grizzly Carter, Steele's second-in-command, arrived at Caleb's farm on a beaten-down bike, his face pale under the morning sun. "They're coming, Hart," Grizzly said without preamble. "The vultures don't forgive debts, and Steele's been running protection rackets under their flag. If they think this place is worth anything, they'll burn it to the ground." Caleb's calm exterior didn't waver. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm done," Grizzly admitted, looking away. "The wolves are finished. I just want to get out of this alive." "Then help us," Caleb replied. "Tell me everything you know." At the community center, Caleb, Sheriff Riley, and Pastor Whitaker gathered the town leaders. Grizzly's warning had lit a fire under their preparations. Plans were drawn up, checkpoints on major roads, patrol schedules, and emergency shelters. Evelyn Grant took charge of logistics. "If these vultures think they can scare us off, they've got another thing coming," she declared. "We'll stand with Caleb like he stood for us." As dusk approached, the valley braced itself. Caleb's farm became a command post, its barn lit like a beacon. Volunteers worked tirelessly, hammering planks, setting up floodlights, and preparing the land for whatever was to come. In the distance, faint headlights appeared on the horizon. The vultures had arrived. "Time to see what this valley is made of," Caleb murmured as he stepped into the night, ready to defend not just his home but the community that had finally found its voice. The headlights on the horizon multiplied, cutting through the darkness like the sharp edges of a blade. The Crimson Vultures had arrived in force, 30 motorcycles, reinforced by trucks loaded with men. Their leader, a towering figure called Reaper, dismounted at the edge of Caleb's farm, his shadow stretching long in the barn's floodlights. "Nice place you've got here," Reaper called out, his voice cold and deliberate. "Heard you've been causing trouble for Steele and his friends." Caleb stepped into the light, calm and unflinching. "You're not welcome here." Reaper smirked. "You think you can stop us? We're not the wolves, old man. We don't just take farms, we raise them." Behind Caleb, the community stirred. Farmers, shopkeepers, and reformed wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces resolute. Sheriff Riley and his deputies took up positions, their presence lending an air of authority to the gathering. "This isn't just my farm," Caleb said evenly. "It's our home. If you want to destroy it, you'll have to face all of us." The vultures didn't wait for a second invitation. Reaper waved his hand, and the gang surged forward. Trucks sped onto the field, tearing up crops, while bikers spread out to surround the barn. But the community was ready. Floodlights snapped on, blinding the vultures as Caleb's carefully laid traps came to life. Irrigation pipes burst into geysers, drenching the attackers in mud and water. Heavy farm equipment blocked escape routes, forcing the gang into tighter spaces. Caleb moved like a ghost through the chaos, disarming one man and redirecting another into a ditch. Sheriff Riley and his deputies worked to corral the more aggressive bikers, their coordination honed by weeks of planning. Meanwhile, Grizzly Carter led a group of reformed wolves, their loyalty now with the valley. They knew the vultures' tactics and countered them with precision. Inside the barn, Evelyn Grant had set up a triage station with Dr. Anna Morales. "Bring them in," Evelyn barked, her hands steady as she worked to treat the injured, both friend and foe. One of the vultures, pinned under a collapsed fence, looked up at her in confusion. "Why are you helping me?" "Because we're not like you." she replied curtly. Now hold still. As the battle raged, Reaper made his way toward Caleb, a crowbar in his hand. You think you're a hero, don't you? He sneered. Caleb faced him, unarmed but unyielding. No, just a man protecting what matters. Reaper swung, but Caleb sidestepped, catching his arm and twisting it with practiced precision. The crowbar clattered to the ground. With one final move, Caleb sent Reaper sprawling into the mud. The gang's momentum faltered as their leader fell. Seeing their comrades overwhelmed, many began retreating. Sheriff Riley's deputies moved in, securing the remaining vultures and restoring order. By dawn, the valley was quiet again. The vultures' vehicles were impounded, their members taken into custody. Reaper, shackled and fuming, glared at Caleb as he was loaded into a police car. This isn't over, he hissed. It is, Caleb replied simply, turning back to his farm. The community gathered in the morning light, weary but triumphant. Farmers surveyed the damage, already discussing how to rebuild. Evelyn passed out coffee and muffins, her wooden spoon tucked into her apron like a badge of honor. Sheriff Riley clapped Caleb on the shoulder. You gave this valley something to believe in, Caleb. It wasn't just me, Caleb said, looking at the faces of his neighbors. We stood together. As the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, Caleb glanced toward the horizon. Knowing the fight wasn't just about defending his farm, it was about proving that even in the face of darkness, unity could prevail. The first rays of sunlight warmed the soil of Green Ridge Valley, glinting off the battered but unbroken fences of Caleb Hart's farm. The chaos of the night before lingered in the churned earth and broken equipment, but the people of the valley stood tall, their resolve shining brighter than the morning light. Caleb leaned against the barn door, his eyes sweeping the fields where neighbors worked together to restore what had been damaged. Farmers tilled the soil, shopkeepers hauled supplies, and even the reformed wolves, now allies, helped mend fences and rebuild. Evelyn Grant appeared by Caleb's side, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. It's a mess now, but give it time, she said with a reassuring smile. This valley has strong roots just like your roses. Caleb chuckled softly. It's not just the valley, Evelyn. It's the people. They showed their strength last night. At the community center, Sheriff Riley held a debrief with his deputies and town leaders. Deputy Clara Bates reported the aftermath. 17 arrests, including Reaper and his top men, she said, flipping through her notebook. No serious injuries on our side, thanks to Dr. Morales and Evelyn's triage work. Pastor Whitaker nodded solemnly. And the others? Clara hesitated. Some of the vultures surrendered willingly. A few of them, they seemed relieved. Sheriff Riley leaned back in his chair. Then we give them the same choice Caleb gave the wolves. They can help rebuild, or they can rot in a cell. By noon, the valley was alive with activity. Caleb's barn had become the heart of the recovery effort, its walls adorned with charts, schedules, and lists of resources. Grizzly Carter stood at the center, organizing volunteers with surprising efficiency. Never thought I'd see the day I'd be fixing fences instead of breaking them, he muttered, drawing laughter from the group. Meanwhile, the reformed wolves worked side by side with townsfolk, a sight that had once seemed impossible. Even the most skeptical residents began to soften as they saw the genuine effort and humility of the former gang members. That evening, the town gathered for a celebration under the stars. Long tables stretched across Caleb's field, piled high with food prepared by neighbors. Evelyn's pies, as always, were the highlight. Caleb stood to address the crowd, his voice steady and calm. Last night wasn't just about defending this farm. It was about standing together, about proving that fear doesn't define us. This valley is more than land or crops. It's us, all of us, and what we're willing to fight for. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers echoing into the night. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of Green Ridge Valley became a symbol of resilience and unity. Former enemies became protectors, patrolling roads and assisting with community projects. Rebuilt fences gave way to new gardens, and the scars of conflict healed with each shared effort. Sheriff Riley received calls from nearby counties, asking about the Greenridge model for addressing gang violence and rebuilding communities. Caleb, though reluctant, became a reluctant advisor, sharing the lessons he'd learned through his quiet but steadfast leadership. One evening, as the sun set over the repaired fields, Caleb stood among the blooming roses Lily had planted so many years ago. Evelyn joined him, carrying a basket of fresh muffins. "You've done something incredible here, Caleb," she said softly. "I didn't do it alone," Caleb replied, his voice thoughtful. "The valley came together. That's what made this possible." As the stars appeared above, their light reflected in the dew-covered petals of the roses. Greenridge Valley wasn't just a place of peace now. It was a place of purpose, a beacon for others to follow. And for Caleb, it was a reminder that even the darkest nights could give way to a brighter dawn when people chose to stand together. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.